Welcome back to Finding Perfect Property, Diary of a Buying Agent. I'm Camilla Dell, and today I am absolutely delighted to have Michael Lewis on the podcast. Michael is a partner at global consultancy firm EY, which was previously known as Ernst & Young. Michael has over 27 years of experience in advising on US and UK private client tax issues. He provides advice across a broad spectrum of areas, including US and UK interaction on personal income, capital and social security taxes, US gift and estate taxes, UK inheritance tax, and tax-efficient charitable planning. Michael is a qualified tax advisor, a US enrolled agent, and a STEP trust and estate practitioner. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Camilla, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
I feel like introducing you, the word tax came up again and again and again. So for the benefit of listeners who may not be familiar with your work, can you explain a little bit about EY's private client services and what your team does, how you advise international clients, particularly those coming from the US?
Yeah. So I sit in the private client services team, but specifically I co-lead US-UK cross-border team. And that team is a specialist team which looks after private clients who have both a US and a UK tax angle, ideally both together and where there's some kind of coalescence. So on the US side, the US connection might be US citizenship, it might be a US family member, or it might be some form of US assets or property. But when you're dealing with two of the world's most complex tax systems at the same time, specialist tax advice is required to ensure you don't get it wrong. In fact, a lot of our job really involves translating between the US and the UK tax terminology, because what often seems familiar very often isn't. And when it comes to tax, we truly are divided by a common language.
Thank you, Michael. There's been a lot of talk over the last little while. I think this goes back, a few years now, that the UK is seeing increasing interest from US buyers. What do you think is driving this trend?
Well, the UK has actually been a very attractive location for Americans back since the mid-80s when financial liberalization first started occurring. And that's for many reasons: culture, language, business opportunity, and even friendly tax rules have encouraged Americans to come here. Now, it is true, the immediate aftermath of the sort of Brexit vote, it did seem that, that Americans arriving slowed down. Then again, post-COVID, it picked up. So while there might also have been a slight Trump effect, disruption in America, people may be using that as a reason to leave. What I think we're really seeing is a continuation of a process of built-up, pent-up demand post that slowdown, after Brexit, and of people, Americans just continuing to come. And what looks a bit unusual is, of course, Americans continuing to come in a world where other nationalities are leaving, and that makes it more noticeable that they're arriving. Albeit, I think it's a continuation of a trend rather than a new trend per se. And it's worth saying, of course, that the income tax and inheritance rules, which are causing so many other nationalities to consider whether they should leave the UK, are much less of an issue for Americans, given that Americans have worldwide taxation and will always be exposed to similar taxes. So even with the end of the non-dom rules, we're planning the UK is still a very attractive location to live for Americans, especially if you compare to living back in the States in certain very high tax jurisdictions like New York or California.
So are you saying, therefore, that London could actually be more attractive for a US person coming from one of those high tax states? Like
Yeah,
New York?
I mean, it is. I'm not saying more attractive. It is attractive. It was attractive in the past, and it continues to be attractive even with the end of the non-dom regime.
Yeah.
The UK is a lower tax location for the ultra-wealthy than New York or California.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we see at BlackBrick, when I think about our US client base, most of them are coming from New York, Washington, San Francisco tends to be where we see the biggest flow. I'm guessing those are the states with the highest taxes.
Well, California and New York, absolutely. Washington is a no-tax state, so that's perhaps sort of an outlier.
That must be Trump.
Right, but that might be coming for other reasons because, no doubt that those are probably people in the technology industry looking to probably exploit UK intellectual property.
Yeah. Very interesting. I want to move on and talk a little bit about sort of the bigger picture, US versus UK property landscape. There are big differences in terms of, how the property market works in the US and how the property market works in the UK. We spend a lot of time holding clients' hands, and explaining to them what those differences are in terms of how the market works here when they're looking to buy. But what about from a tax perspective? How does UK property differ from the US in terms of ownership, taxation and regulation?
Well, it's worth saying that there is no such thing as a US system of property ownership, because what we're really talking about is 50 different state systems, and each have their own unique rules and quirks. Some states will follow common law, so they have some of the familiar concepts of joint tenancy, tenants in common, while other states follow civil law and will have sort of community property rules. And obviously that has an impact on property acquisition. We also in these states have the concepts of sort of realtors as opposed to real estate agents, and it's a much more highly regulated profession. They have to have, much more, detailed qualifications. But then again, the fees are much, much larger in the US.
I knew I should have been an estate agent in America.
A major difference, which confuses Americans, is the chain that we have. Right, that just doesn't really happen in America. It's very, very unusual to have a contingency in your purchase agreement, which requires your property to sell.
Yeah.
Rather, they move to contracts quickly.
Yeah.
And they have very short windows to do their due diligence and very short windows to close. And so it's kind of like everything happens very quickly in America. You find your property, you sell your property, and then you move all together without there being a chain. And you have an upfront deposit, usually of at least 1%, to encourage you to go through with it, because if you don't, that's completely lost.
Fantastic.
So that is the chain is probably one of the biggest differences between the UK and the US markets.
Yeah, and the speed as well.
Exactly.
So it sounds like they have a more efficient system.
Exactly.
Than we
I think I read that in America about 5% of transactions fall through.
Yeah.
When I think in the UK, you might know better, but I think it's like in excess of 35 or something, right?
So perhaps there's something that we can learn from the way they do things in the States. I think certainly when it comes to regulating estate agents, I'm in full support that we should be. It's just amazing that that we're not. So I think that's definitely something that will potentially happen going forward in the future. I don't know whether you've got any visibility on this. I mean, one of the things when I'm looking after US clients, sometimes they're quite shocked at the way we do things here. When we start to explain to them about our conveyancing process and how long it takes, and they don't have to put down the 1%, and another buyer could come in and gazump them and the whole deal could fall apart. It's quite shocking sometimes, some of our US clients, when you start to explain to them these differences. But apart from that, are there any other sort of main misconceptions that you think US clients have?
I think you just covered it. And I think it really comes down to the time it required to buy a property.
Yeah.
I think even when you tell them it takes longer, they just do not conceive of how long. They kind of think, it'll be a few weeks to find a property. I put in an offer, and then a few weeks to actually close on this property, right? Which, of course, we both know is not the case.
Wishful thinking.
So there is major misconception about the period required of looking and completing. They also misconception about how the system works in terms of they kind of assume a bit like America, you find a realtor who helps you with the whole process, when that is actually unusual. But the good news for you, Camilla, is that they are used to paying for someone to help them find property, navigate the property market, negotiate on their behalf. But they just don't realize that people like yourself are unusual and have to be sought out.
Yeah.
Right? They just expect to be going on the high street and they'll find someone like yourself.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is not the case. Yeah. And I said, but the main issue is really the time it takes. Right? And that is just a major education that we need to give Americans when they're looking.
Yeah, agreed. And then we spoke a lot about London being popular with Americans. Are you seeing interest spreading to other parts of the UK? There's been a lot of talk about the Cotswolds and genre and Tom Cruise and
Well, I was gonna say the Cotswolds. So London is, of course, the main place. So you know, Kensington, Knightsbridge have always been very popular for Americans. And Americans, the rest of London, where there's a good American school, will obviously also be popular.
Yeah.
But there does appear to be that an interest in looking a bit further afield. No doubt, TV shows. What's his name from Top Gear? Toxins. Make people look at a bit the wider English countryside. And the Cotswold is. We are seeing some interest in there as well, which...
Yeah, interesting times from, what was once, predominantly Cotswolds, mainly Brits living there permanently, some second homeowners, and now quite a lot of Americans. It's stunning. Yeah. I want to move on to sort of tax and structuring considerations, like, things that US buyers need to think of before coming here and buying a property here from a tax perspective. What are some of the biggest pitfalls do you think US buyers should be aware of before they jump in?
Well, the number one is the stamp duty cost, right? I think when you explain the stamp duty cost, it just blows their minds. The cost of acquisition.
There's no stamp duty in the States.
No, they might have minor state transfer taxes, but they are really low, right? We're talking like 0.5% or something, right?
Yes.
So not significant in the same way. And of course, the fact that these stamp duties have surtaxes for being, perhaps non-residents or having a second property. And of course, it's extremely common for Americans to have property already when they're buying in the UK. So taking advice about these stamp duty taxes, understanding them, the cost, and budgeting for them, very important. But also doing planning to see whether you can avoid the surcharges, at least get it down to a more acceptable level is very important. However, while stamp duty is very high, what we always do when we talk to, our clients about buying properties, to look at the overall cost of lifetime ownership, because there things become a little bit more interesting. The stamp duty, of course, is a deduction for future US capital gains tax purposes, which helps reduce the cost of that expense. Also, the realtor fees that they would have been expecting to pay in America on both purchase and sale are much less in the UK.
Yeah.
Right? And thirdly, in the US, they have really high annual real estate taxes.
Yeah.
And frankly, council tax is just nothing in comparison. Now, we'll have to see what happens if the UK government ever introduces a mansion tax. Will that change things? But currently, the annual taxes of owning property are much lower in the UK than in America. So you could see stamp duty as almost like an upfront capital costs in lieu of real estate taxes. So if you look at an overall lifetime ownership or a 10-year period, the UK doesn't actually look that expensive. And that's the way we kind of encourage our clients to kind of look things. So look at it in the round over a longer period.
That's really interesting. And I wasn't aware that the stamp duty could be offset on capital gains tax that they have to pay on other things in the States. So that's a big incentive. So that's interesting and good to know. What about inheritance tax? Obviously, inheritance tax is a big thing, I think, for anyone buying in the UK. 40% what about US buyers? Are there ways that they can structure themselves to protect themselves from IHT?
So inheritance tax is a major consideration. If you buy UK property, you are exposed to UK inheritance tax. There is a comprehensive estate tax treaty between the US and UK, but it doesn't help for property. So you buy property, you are exposed to UK inheritance tax. And the US estate tax system does have extremely large exemptions, amount $15 million from 2026 per person. So a married couple can exempt $30 million of assets, right? Compared to in the UK, a mildly
300,000?
Yes, 325,000 exactly.
Oh my gosh.
Really don't compare.
That's crazy.
However, that said, there are some similarities between the two systems. Firstly, the actual top tax rate is the same. They're both 40%.
Okay.
The way they work is the same. It's both technically a tax on the estate, right? Both have an exemption for transfers between spouses. And what this basically means is that for the super wealthy, those in excess of 30 million, buying a UK property in no way increases their global exposure to taxes. They're just replacing US estate tax with UK inheritance tax at the same rate. They'll get an offsetting credit. It's a neutral transaction. You don't actually probably need to do much in the way of planning. Right?
Okay.
Now, for those below that 30 million threshold, where it really does make a difference, well, you could look at some planning, and we'll come on to that. But mostly, we would go down the life insurance routes, right? That we insure the inheritance tax risk, and use trust structure to protect the insurance payout from tax.
That's very interesting with the $30 million. So above that, regardless of where they're owning assets, they would be having to pay tax on death. And is it the same rate? Is it
exactly 40%? Oh, wow. So it works out very well and very clean.
Okay.
And in terms of structures, Americans are very used to buying their property through structures, through LLCs, through trusts. But actually, the way the UK tax system has worked, the last few years, that just really complicates matters. And while we might see nominee purchase arrangements, we tend not to see arrangements now where the economic interest is held through structures. And we more often than not encourage our clients to own the UK property economically in their personal names.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing similar and have been for a while. I want to talk a little bit about financing and how US buyers go about buying their properties here, and also currency. Do you find a lot of your clients from the US take finance when they're buying here, or are they mainly buying in cash?
They do take finance, but then they used to take finance. So I think you need to understand, firstly, that Americans, in the US tax system, they're encouraged to take finance, right? So they will take significant debt on the property, either at purchase or at refinancing. And this is because the US gives a tax deduction, at least for part of your home acquisition debt and the interest on that. But also, if you refinance your property and then you use those funds to make investments, the interest is tax deductible on that as an investment interest expense. Wow. So Americans are extremely used to being highly leveraged on their property. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, of course, when they come to the UK is that because they're exposed to worldwide taxation, they think, I still need a US tax deduction. Actually, it's a misnomer, because when they're in the UK, their focus should be on the UK tax system, in priority to the US, and of course the UK gives no deduction. And when we educate them, they become much less inclined, to take out so much debt. But that's still a cultural thing that they do. The other issue with debt is that there is a major problem which Americans need to be educated about, and that is what's we call the mortgage exchange rate gain issue. And this is a hard concept for Americans to understand. But the US tax system regards a foreign currency denominated mortgage as a financial instrument.
Right.
And if an American pays off a mortgage for less dollars than they borrowed, then they are deemed to make a profit.
Oh, wow.
Which is subject to income tax.
Okay.
Now, we've had scenarios where people have made losses on their property and have still had an exchange rate gain subject to income tax. Deeply upsetting. Now, there is planning that you can do with this, but, the first thing is to make clients aware of this. And again, that's another reason why, clients who are educated would go, actually, I perhaps don't want to leverage as much as I might have done if I was purchasing in the States.
Interesting. These little nuances that don't affect British buyers, but are very relevant for the sorts of clients you advise. That's fascinating. And talking about currency fluctuation in terms of the decision-making process, you talked about, the flux of buyers coming in post-Brexit. We also saw quite a big flux then because obviously our cable rate, pound crashed, dollar was very strong. I think Americans just thought, wow, it's sale time. How important do you think currency fluctuation is in terms of the decision-making process for Americans?
Well, I think it's been a big factor in the past. And I think if you look over a sort of 15-year period, perhaps the UK still looks cheap from a currency perspective. Yeah. And the currency fluctuation is a big issue for that exchange rate gain I mentioned before. About the exposure. And Americans who are familiar with that issue may look to manage that, and they might do that through looking to see whether they have a US dollar mortgage. And, some of them large financial institutions will offer that, albeit for the appropriate fee.
Yes.
For the appropriate loan to value ratio, for, the right interest rate, etc. And so that's one way of managing it. But there's other ways of managing it if they speak to their tax advisor and they take some planning, albeit they always will take that planning before they end up leaving the UK. And our biggest problem is people who, decide to leave the UK, then pay off the mortgage. It's often too late for us to be able to do anything.
Yeah. So getting your advice and coming to you early is key. I want to move on a little bit and talk about everybody's least favourite subject, compliance, fact of life here in the UK. Do you think when US buyers come here that there's any kind of regulatory or compliance issues that they may not be expecting with regards to kind of AML, anti-money laundering checks, or are they kind of used to that? That's just what you have to do in America as well?
I mean, the checks in America are so slight compared to the UK.
Wow.
Really, right?
Just give me a feel. What do you have to do in America to buy a property or open a bank account?
I mean, a bank statement, or perhaps a jobs. A payment slip from your employer.
And that's it. Just one thing.
Yeah, okay. Pretty much. Right? You got your driving license, you're done. Right?
So when they come here and we start asking them for certified proof of address, certified proof of ID, source of wealth, proof of funds.
And this goes back again to the time it takes. So, the requirements to prove your source of wealth, arranging finance in the UK without a UK credit history, right? The fact we talked before about the conveyancing process, the surveys process. In America, people may rely on the declarations made by the seller because those declarations, it's very litigious. Yeah. No seller would ever not be, very honest about the property. Otherwise, they were opening themselves up to a world of legal litigation. Yeah. Now, in the UK, I think people, it's like if it's not visible, it doesn't exist.
Although there was Mothgate. Mothgate.
Yes, it's true.
But it's a one-off. It made the press because I think it was so unusual.
Yeah. But, like everyone, paints over the damp. The survey doesn't see it.
Buyer beware.
Buyer beware, exactly. So those things are, all things surprised Americans when they're purchasing. I think they're also surprised by how easy it is to find information about what a property sold for and who bought it. Now, it's not that information isn't available in the States, it is, but that information is usually only readily available to realtors.
Yes.
Right? I think there's some sort of listing system.
Zillow or or I think it's MLS, multi-listing.
Yes, yeah. Which the realtors have access to, but the general public don't.
Yeah.
And I think that surprises them.
Interesting. So we've got a US buyer coming to the UK, thinking about buying a property here. How early on do you think they should engage with people like yourself?
Well, it would surprise you to say for me to say it very early. So
before they get here.
Well, I'd want them to make sure that the purchasing is the right idea for them. So actually, I would say come to London, make sure you like it before you make that kind of commitment. Make sure you like the lifestyle. But as soon as they start thinking about it, even as an idea, I'd be recommending that they come and speak to someone like yourself. That's because the property market in the UK very different. It's even within London, they need to understand the nuances of different areas. Which, why are properties different values in different areas, and not simply going to understand that. I would also recommend that they speak to their bankers very early on to understand what financing they can get, because it may not be as easy to get finance over here as it might be in the States. And there are other complications, especially where if they're looking to buy a property which might involve a partial or full demolition followed by renovation, and those kind of financing options need to be agreed up front before you can even consider making an offer. In terms of tax, it would also be fantastic if US buyers approached people like EY right from the very start to understand some of the issues that we've talked about, whether it's a stamp duty, exchange rate gained, albeit in practice that virtually never happens.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I agree. I think, putting that professional team in place as early as possible is a good idea, including things like schools advisors if they're permanently relocating here. Okay, I want to move on to looking ahead, crystal balls and all of that. Obviously, tricky because we've got the budget at the end of November, so a lot could change. But as things stand now, do you think the UK will continue to attract high net worth buyers from the US?
Actually, I do. I am really optimistic about this, albeit, you never know what the government could do to kibosh things. But the pull factors we mentioned earlier about language, culture, continue to exist. And even outside the EU, just location is a good, it means the UK is a good ground for people to have an offshore office for the EU market, so to speak. Yeah. And even though the non-dom regime has gone, the new replacement of foreign income and gains regime is in some ways actually better suited for Americans than the old non-dom regime. So you combine this with and we talked about the very high taxes in certain states such as New York and California, and you also add on the very attractive terms in the US-UK estate tax treaty, which can enable a lot of planning which is unavailable to other nationalities. And you have an environment and a tax system which actually is relatively favorable to Americans. So I think you'll continue to have that cultural draw, and the tax is just like the icing. Say, come to the UK and we can get your tax rate down to a similar level that you would have if you moved to Florida, say.
That's amazing that there seems to be such a tax advantage almost for Americans coming to the UK, whereas, sitting here as a UK res, UK dom, we feel like we're, taxed very, very highly. But for Americans, it's not.
Yeah, it's all relative, as I say,
Very interesting. Finally, if you could give one piece of advice to a US buyer considering a UK property purchase right now, what would it be?
Don't expect it to be quick. So, if as I said before, I would encourage people to get to know the UK market through renting, but as soon as you decide to start looking, do it properly, and don't wait until the end of your rental agreement. It's not a quick process. Perhaps start at the beginning of your rental agreements, because it will take way longer than you ever expect.
Don't let that put you off, though, if you're listening, but that's great advice. I'm going to finish the podcast by asking you a few fun little questions. Quick fire round, Michael. Prime Central London or Manhattan?
I think, for me, London will always be the best city in the world. And I do think Manhattan is fantastic, just to be very clear. But I just really feel that London has everything.
Agreed. Advisory or audit?
Some people call me an accountant, but to be very clear, in my mind, I am most definitely not an accountant. So, advisory.
Interest rates, higher for longer or cuts coming?
Oh, I'm not even going to make any prediction here because, it all comes down to the economy, and I really have very little faith in the current government.
Email or WhatsApp?
Email, only because I get so many WhatsApps. Sometimes I just don't even read them.
Fair enough. Dream property anywhere in the world?
Certainly hot, coast,
beach. Like it.
Yeah.
And finally, one thing you wish your younger self at EY had known?
I think this is career advice for anyone, actually. And it's the important thing to progress. As important as being good at your job is actually showcasing that you're good at your job. And you should not be shy about talking about your successes.
Like it. Great advice. Thank you so much, Michael. That was fascinating. I've certainly learned loads today about why the UK is so attractive for US buyers. I think that's been eye-opening and really insightful. And that now brings us to the end of this month's episode of Finding Perfect Property, Diary of a Buying Agent. And for more information on how to purchase a property in prime central London, please get in touch via our website. If you need help on tax matters, then please feel free to reach out to Michael Lewis at EY. And don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever podcast channel you use to listen. Thank you for listening. See you next time.